The stagecoach wheel hit a rock on the rutted mountain road, sending the entire carriage lurching violently to the left. And in that split second, everything changed for Eleanor Foster as the horses screamed and the driver lost control on the treacherous Wyoming Territory Pass in the summer of 1878. She pressed her gloved hands against the worn leather seat, trying to brace herself as the stagecoach tilted at an impossible angle, the other two passengers shouting in terror as gravity took hold and pulled them all sideways. The door flew open, and suddenly there was nothing but air and sky spinning around her as the coach tumbled down the steep hillside, bouncing off rocks and pine trees, splintering wood and shattering glass, filling the air with deadly projectiles. Eleanor felt her body slam against something hard, then she was weightless again, falling, tumbling, her carefully pinned auburn hair coming loose from its proper bun as her traveling hat disappeared into the chaos. She tried to scream, but the wind knocked it from her lungs, and then everything went black as the world became a confusion of pain and noise and the sickening sensation of falling endlessly into nothing. When the stagecoach finally came to rest at the bottom of the ravine, wedged between two massive boulders near a rushing creek, there was only silence, broken by the trickling of water over stones. The horses had broken free during the descent, their traces snapped, and they had bolted into the forest. The driver lay motionless 20 feet from the wreckage, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The older gentleman who had been traveling to Fort Laramie was thrown clear early in the fall and had died instantly when his head struck a granite outcrop. The other woman, a stout matron from Pennsylvania, was pinned beneath the overturned coach, her eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy of pines above. Eleanor Foster, 22 years old and traveling west from Boston to meet her intended husband in California, was somehow still breathing. She lay half in the creek, the cold mountain water soaking through her dark green traveling dress, one leg twisted beneath her at a painful angle. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, mixing with the creek water that rushed past her face. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow, her skin pale as porcelain in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the trees. Lucas Nolan had been checking his trap lines in the high country when he heard the distant sounds of the crash echoing through the mountains. He froze mid-step, his weathered hand still holding the beaver trap he had just retrieved, his ice-blue eyes scanning the ridgeline in the direction of the noise. Living alone in these mountains for the past 5 years had made him attuned to every sound, every shift in the wind, every call of the birds that might signal danger or distress. What he had just heard was neither natural nor good. He was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders broad and heavily muscled from years of hard living in the wilderness. His dark brown hair fell past his collar, tied back with a leather cord to keep it from his face, though a few strands had worked loose and hung around his strong jaw. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing a face that was ruggedly handsome despite the weathering of sun and wind. His arms, visible beneath the rolled sleeves of his rough-spun shirt, were corded with muscle, built from swinging axes and hauling water and wrestling with the harsh demands of mountain life. Lucas dropped the trap and immediately began moving toward the sound, his long legs carrying him swiftly through the underbrush. He knew these mountains like other men knew the streets of their towns, every game trail and rock formation mapped in his mind through countless seasons of solitary wandering. The crash had come from somewhere near Eagle Creek, a treacherous stretch of road that wound along the edge of a steep ravine. Stagecoaches used that route despite its dangers because it shaved half a day off the journey to the territorial capital. It took him nearly 20 minutes of hard running and climbing to reach the top of the ravine where the road cut through the mountains. When he got there, he could see the fresh gouges in the earth where the stagecoach had left the road, the broken branches of bushes marking its violent descent. His jaw tightened as he peered down into the ravine, spotting the wreckage far below, nearly invisible among the rocks and trees. Without hesitation, Lucas began his descent. He moved with the sure-footedness of a mountain goat, finding handholds on rocks and roots, lowering himself carefully down the steep slope. His powerful arms took much of his weight as he climbed, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt as he controlled his descent. Smaller rocks and pebbles skittered down ahead of him, bouncing off the larger boulders below. The entire time, his eyes scanned the wreckage, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that someone might have survived. When he finally reached the bottom, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. He checked the driver first, finding no pulse in the man's neck, then moved to the gentleman whose broken body lay sprawled on the rocks. The woman beneath the coach was clearly dead as well, her face already taking on the waxy stillness that Lucas had seen too many times in his life. Then he heard it, a faint sound barely audible over the rushing creek. A moan, soft and pained, coming from near the water. Lucas moved quickly, his boots splashing through the shallow creek as he approached the crumpled form half submerged in the icy water. His heart, which he had thought hardened by years of solitude and loss, clenched in his chest when he saw her face. She was young, her features delicate and refined in a way that spoke of eastern cities and gentle upbringings. Blood matted her auburn hair and stained her pale forehead, but her chest was rising and falling with shallow breaths. She was alive, against all odds. She was alive. Lucas knelt beside her in the creek, the cold water soaking through his buckskin trousers as he carefully assessed her condition. The gash on her head was bleeding, but not severely. Her left leg was definitely broken. He could see the unnatural angle even through her sodden skirts. She likely had other injuries he could not see, broken ribs perhaps, internal damage from the violent tumble down the mountainside. "Can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Living alone meant he sometimes went weeks without speaking aloud, and his words came out gravelly and deep. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered but did not open. Another soft moan escaped her lips and her head moved slightly in the water. Lucas knew he had to get her out of the creek before the cold water sent her into fatal shock. He slid his arms beneath her body, one under her shoulders and one under her knees, lifting her as gently as he could. Even weakened by injury, he could feel how slight she was in his arms, her weight nothing to a man who regularly carried deer carcasses in heavy pelts through these mountains. Her head lolled against his broad chest as he stood, and he could feel the coldness of her skin through the wet fabric of her dress. He carried her to a relatively flat spot near the wreckage, laying her down on a patch of soft grass away from the bodies of the other passengers. Her breathing remained shallow and her eyes stayed closed, but she was still alive, and Lucas was determined to keep her that way. The practical part of his mind took over, the part that had kept him alive through harsh winters and dangerous encounters with both animals and men. He needed to stop the bleeding from her head wound, immobilize her broken leg, and get her warm and dry before shock set in completely. Then he needed to figure out how to get her up the ravine and back to his cabin, because leaving her here was not an option. Lucas moved to the wrecked stagecoach and began searching through the scattered luggage. He found a trunk that had burst open, revealing neatly folded clothing that likely belonged to the dead matron. He grabbed several pieces of fabric, tearing them into strips for bandages. From another bag, he retrieved a blanket that had somehow remained relatively dry despite the chaos. He returned to Eleanor and carefully wrapped the makeshift bandage around her head, applying pressure to the wound until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. Her face was so pale, it frightened him, her lips tinged with blue from the cold water. He needed to get her out of the wet dress, but propriety warred with necessity in his mind. Out here, miles from any town or help, propriety could kill her as surely as her injuries. "Forgive me," he murmured, though she could not hear him, and he carefully began working the buttons of her dress. His large, calloused fingers struggled with the tiny fastenings, but eventually he managed to peel the sodden fabric away from her skin. Beneath, she wore a corset and chemise, both thoroughly soaked. The corset was laced so tightly he marveled that she could breathe at all, and he knew it had to come off before it restricted her breathing further. He worked quickly and efficiently, trying not to think about the impropriety of undressing an unconscious woman he had just met. Years of dressing game and working with his hands made him deft despite the intimacy of the task. Once he had her down to her chemise and drawers, both still damp but not soaking. He wrapped her in the dry blanket, tucking it around her carefully. Her broken leg was the next problem. Lucas retrieved 2 sturdy branches from the wreckage and more strips of fabric. He had set bones before, on himself, and once on a trapper he had found injured in a snowstorm, but it was never pleasant, and he dreaded causing this fragile woman more pain. Still, it had to be done. "This is going to hurt," he said softly, positioning himself at her feet. "I'm sorry." He grasped her ankle firmly and pulled, setting the bone with a quick, sure movement. Eleanor's eyes flew open and she screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the ravine and sent birds scattering from the trees. Her back arched and her hands clawed at the grass, her green eyes wild and unfocused with pain. "Easy. Easy now," Lucas said, his deep voice as soothing as he could make it. He quickly splinted the leg, binding the branches to either side with the fabric strips to immobilize it. "The worst is over. You are safe now." Eleanor's eyes found his face, struggling to focus through the haze of pain and shock. She saw a mountain of a man, broad and powerful, with intense blue eyes that held surprising gentleness. She tried to speak, but only a whimper came out before the pain dragged her back down into unconsciousness. Lucas sat back on his heels, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool mountain air. He looked up at the steep ravine he would have to climb, then back at the unconscious woman. Getting her up that slope would be nearly impossible, but staying here was not an option. Night would fall in a few hours, and the temperature in these mountains dropped drastically after sunset. Without proper shelter, she would not survive until morning. He fashioned a rough travois using branches from the wreckage and rope he always carried in his pack. It was not pretty, but it would allow him to drag her up the slope without causing too much additional injury to her leg. He secured her to the travois with more rope, making sure the blanket stayed wrapped around her, then stood and tested the weight. The climb back up the ravine was brutal. Lucas had to find a less steep path, one that zigzagged back and forth across the slope rather than going straight up. Even with his considerable strength, hauling the travois and its precious cargo over rocks and around trees left him sweating and breathing hard. His powerful legs drove him upward, his arms straining as he pulled the makeshift sled behind him. More than once he had to stop and adjust his grip, his muscles trembling with exertion. By the time he reached the top of the ravine, the sun was sinking toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Lucas did not stop to admire the sunset. He had another 2 miles to cover before he reached his cabin, and he wanted to get there before full dark. He modified the travois slightly, making it easier to pull over the relatively flat ground of the forest floor, and set off at a steady pace. His cabin was located in a small clearing beside a spring-fed pool, surrounded by towering pines and protected on 3 sides by steep rock faces. It was remote enough that he rarely saw another human being, which was exactly why he had chosen it 5 years ago when he had fled civilization and the painful memories it held. The cabin came into view just as the last light was fading from the sky. It was a solid structure, built with his own hands from logs he had felled and hewn himself. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, evidence of the fire he had banked that morning before heading out to check his traps. A small barn stood nearby, housing his pack mule and the few supplies he could not produce himself. Lucas pulled the travois right up to the cabin door, then carefully lifted Eleanor in his arms and carried her inside. The interior was simple but well-maintained, a single large room with a stone fireplace at one end, a sturdy table and chairs in the middle, and his bed built into an alcove at the far end. Shelves lined the walls, holding his supplies, tools, and the few books he had brought with him from his previous life. He laid Eleanor on his bed, the only bed in the cabin, and immediately set about building up the fire. The room was cool from the day's absence, and warmth was essential for someone in shock. Once the fire was blazing, he heated water in his largest pot and gathered the limited medical supplies he kept on hand. Eleanor remained unconscious as he cleaned and properly dressed her head wound. The gash was not as deep as he had feared, and the bleeding had stopped entirely. Her leg was properly splinted, though the swelling had already begun, and he knew the next few days would be critical in determining whether infection set in. He checked her ribs carefully, pressing gently along her sides and back, relieved to find that while she had extensive bruising, he felt no obvious breaks. He managed to get some water between her lips, and she swallowed reflexively, which he took as a good sign. Then he covered her with every blanket he owned and settled into a chair beside the bed, prepared to keep watch through the night. As the fire crackled and the darkness deepened outside his windows, Lucas studied the woman who had so unexpectedly entered his life. She was beautiful, even pale and injured as she was. Her features were refined, her hands soft and uncalloused, everything about her speaking of a life of comfort and privilege in the civilized East. What had brought her out to this harsh territory? Where had she been going when the stagecoach crashed? He found himself hoping she would wake soon, not just for her health, but because he wanted to hear her voice, to see those green eyes focus on him with recognition rather than pain. The thought surprised him. He had been alone for so long, had convinced himself that he preferred it that way, that other people brought only complication and hurt. Yet here he was, anxious about a stranger, worried for her recovery, already feeling protective of this fragile woman who had crashed into his solitary existence. Eleanor's sleep was restless, punctuated by small sounds of distress and movements that made Lucas wince, knowing how much pain she must be in, even unconscious. He dampened a cloth with cool water and pressed it to her forehead, murmuring words of comfort he was not sure she could hear. "You are safe now," he told her softly. "I will not let anything happen to you. Just keep fighting, keep breathing. You are stronger than you know to have survived that fall." Through the long night, he kept vigil, adding wood to the fire, checking her breathing and the bandages, giving her small sips of water whenever her lips would part. His eyes grew heavy, but he refused to sleep, afraid that if he did, she might slip away from him into that darkness from which there was no return. Dawn was breaking through the windows, painting the cabin in soft gray light, when Eleanor's eyes finally opened with true awareness. She blinked several times, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to understand where she was. Her gaze traveled around the unfamiliar room, over the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, the stone fireplace, the shelves of supplies, before finally landing on Lucas. He had stood up from his chair when he saw her stirring, and now he moved closer to the bed, careful not to loom over her in a way that might frighten her. "You are awake," he said, his voice gentle despite its natural roughness. "How do you feel?" Eleanor's lips parted and she tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Lucas immediately reached for the cup of water he had kept ready and slipped his arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her just enough to drink without choking. She took several small sips, her eyes never leaving his face. "Where am I?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" "You were in a stagecoach accident," Lucas explained, lowering her carefully back to the pillow. "The coach went off the road and down into a ravine. I found you and brought you here to my cabin. You have been unconscious for nearly a full day." Eleanor's eyes widened as fragmented memories began to surface. The lurching coach, the screaming, the sensation of falling. "The others," she said urgently, trying to sit up and immediately gasping as pain shot through her body. "The other passengers, are they—" "Do not try to move," Lucas said firmly, his large hand gentle but unyielding on her shoulder, keeping her down. "Your leg is broken and you have other injuries. You need to stay still." "The others?" she repeated, her eyes filling with tears as she read the answer in his solemn expression. "I am sorry," Lucas said quietly. "You were the only survivor." A sob escaped Eleanor's throat, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She had not known the other passengers well, had only boarded the coach with them 2 days earlier, but they had been alive, and now they were not, and she was, and the injustice and randomness of it overwhelmed her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did I survive and they did not?" "I do not know," Lucas answered honestly. "Sometimes there is no reason. Sometimes things just happen, and we have to find a way to keep living despite not understanding why." There was something in his voice, a depth of old pain, that made Eleanor focus on him more clearly despite her tears. She saw a man who had known loss, who spoke from experience when he talked about finding a way to keep living. "Who are you?" she asked. "Lucas Nolan," he said. "I have a cabin here in the mountains. I live alone, trap and hunt for my living. I heard the crash and came to help." "You saved my life," Eleanor said, fresh tears flowing. "You climbed down into that ravine and brought me back up. You set my leg and brought me here. You saved me." "Anyone would have done the same," Lucas said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "But there was no one else," Eleanor pointed out. "There was only you. If you had not been there, if you had not heard, I would have died in that creek." She reached out with a trembling hand and touched his arm, her small fingers resting on the corded muscle of his forearm. "Thank you. I do not even know how to properly thank you for giving me back my life. But thank you." Lucas felt the touch of her hand like a brand, burning through the fabric of his shirt straight to his skin. He looked down at her pale fingers against his sun-darkened arm, at the contrast between her delicate femininity and his rough masculinity, and something shifted in his chest. "You are welcome," he said gruffly. "What is your name?" "Eleanor Foster," she replied. "I am from Boston. I was traveling to California to meet my intended husband." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow, though he showed no outward reaction. Of course she had a husband waiting for her. A woman like her would not be traveling west alone without a destination, without someone expecting her arrival. "He will be worried when you do not arrive," Lucas said neutrally. "I suppose he will," Eleanor said, though her voice was oddly flat. She had never met Martin Ashworth, the man she was supposed to marry. Their engagement had been arranged by her father, a business transaction between two men who saw mutual benefit in the union. Martin owned a prosperous ranch in California and wanted a wife. Eleanor's father wanted connections and opportunities in the growing West. Eleanor's own wants had not entered into the equation. She had been raised to be obedient, to accept that her father knew what was best for her future. But lying here in this rough cabin, in the bed of a mountain man who had saved her life, feeling the pain of her injuries and the grief of surviving when others had not, Eleanor found herself questioning everything she had accepted without argument for her entire 22 years. "You should rest," Lucas said, withdrawing slightly. "Your body has been through tremendous trauma. Sleep is the best medicine right now." "Will you stay?" Eleanor asked, a note of fear creeping into her voice. "I do not want to be alone." "I will be right here," Lucas assured her. "I need to tend the animals and bring in more wood, but I will not go far. You are safe." Eleanor nodded, her eyelids already growing heavy again. The brief period of wakefulness had exhausted her limited reserves of strength. As she drifted back toward sleep, she felt the rough calluses of Lucas's hand as he smoothed the blanket over her shoulders, and she found comfort in that touch, in the gentleness that such a powerful man could show. Over the following days, a routine developed in the small cabin. Lucas would wake before dawn and tend to the morning chores, feeding his mule and checking his trap lines in the immediate area. He would return and make breakfast, simple fare of cornmeal mush or fried salt pork and biscuits, and help Eleanor sit up enough to eat. Her appetite was poor at first, but he coaxed her to take at least a few bites, knowing she needed nourishment to heal. He changed her bandages daily, checking the head wound for signs of infection and monitoring the swelling in her leg. He was pleased to see that both injuries were healing cleanly, though he knew the leg would take weeks to mend properly and she might walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Eleanor was not an easy patient, not because she complained, but because she hated being helpless. She had been raised to be independent within the confines of proper feminine behavior, managing her father's household after her mother's death when she was just 16. Lying in bed, unable to even tend to her most basic needs without assistance, grated against every instinct she had. Lucas proved to be surprisingly patient with her frustration. He helped her without making her feel ashamed, maintaining her dignity even when performing the most intimate tasks. He would turn his back when she needed privacy, would speak to her as an equal rather than as a child or an invalid, would listen when she needed to talk and remain silent when she preferred quiet. As the days passed, they began to learn about each other in the way that two people sharing close quarters inevitably do. Eleanor told him about Boston, about the grand house where she had grown up, about her father's shipping business and the society parties she had attended. She spoke of her mother, dead these 6 years from consumption, and how she still missed her every single day. She talked about books she had read, music she had heard, plays she had seen, painting a picture of a life so different from Lucas's that they might have been living on different planets. Lucas was more reticent about his past, but gradually, bit by bit, Eleanor drew his story from him. He had been raised on a farm in Missouri, the youngest of 4 brothers. He had married young, barely 20, to a girl named Margaret who he had loved since childhood. They had been happy, building a life together, dreaming of the children they would have and the farm they would build. Then, one winter, sickness had swept through their community. Margaret had caught it, and despite Lucas's desperate efforts to save her, she had died in his arms after 3 agonizing days of fever. "I could not stay there after that," Lucas said quietly, staring into the fire as he spoke. "Everywhere I looked, I saw her. Every plan we had made, every dream we had shared, it all turned to ash. My brothers wanted me to stay, to help run the family farm, but I felt like I was suffocating. So I sold my share to them, packed what I could carry, and headed west. How long ago was that? Eleanor asked softly. 5 years this past spring, Lucas replied. I have been in these mountains for most of that time. Built this cabin 3 years ago. It is a good life, a simple life, quiet. Lonely, Eleanor observed. Lucas glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness. Sometimes, he admitted, but loneliness is better than the alternative. Out here, there is no one to lose, no one to watch die, no one to fail. You did not fail her, Eleanor said with certainty. Sickness is not something a person can control, no matter how much they love someone or how hard they fight. The mind knows that, Lucas said, his voice rough with old pain, but the heart is slower to accept it. Eleanor reached out from the bed and took his hand where it rested on his knee. I am sorry for your loss, she said. I truly am. But I am grateful that you were here, that your path led you to these mountains, because if it had not, I would be dead in that ravine. Lucas turned his hand over and squeezed her fingers gently, marveling again at how small and delicate her hand was in his. I'm glad I was here too, he said, and realized with a start that he meant it. Having Eleanor in his cabin, talking with her, caring for her, had awakened something in him that he thought had died with Margaret. He had not realized how much he had missed simple human connection, the sound of another voice, the warmth of shared stories, and gentle laughter. As Eleanor grew stronger, she began to insist on doing more for herself. Lucas helped her fashion a crutch from a sturdy branch, and she practiced moving around the cabin, her broken leg carefully kept off the ground. She was determined and stubborn, pushing herself even when Lucas urged her to rest, and he found himself admiring her strength of will. She began helping with small tasks, peeling vegetables for their meals while sitting at the table, mending Lucas's shirts that had torn seams and missing buttons, organizing his somewhat chaotic shelves into a more logical system. He protested at first, saying she was his guest and should not work, but she insisted that she needed to feel useful, needed to contribute something rather than simply lying in bed being tended to like a helpless child. Besides, she said with a small smile as she surveyed his meager food stores, I do not think you have eaten a properly balanced meal since you came to this mountain. Where are your vegetables? Your fruit? I have vegetables, Lucas protested. Potatoes and onions. Potatoes and onions, Eleanor repeated flatly. What about carrots, cabbage, beans, tomatoes? I'm not much of a gardener, Lucas admitted sheepishly. Clearly, Eleanor said, next spring, if I'm still here, we are planting a proper garden. You cannot live on game meat and potatoes alone. The words, if I am still here, hung in the air between them, and both fell silent. They had been carefully avoiding the subject of Eleanor's eventual departure, the fact that at some point she would need to continue her journey to California and the man waiting for her there. The stage line would eventually send someone to investigate when their coach failed to arrive at the next station. Searchers would find the wreck and the bodies. Eleanor would be presumed dead unless she made herself known. Do you want to marry him? Lucas asked suddenly, the question bursting out before he could stop it. This man in California who's expecting you? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the shirt she had been mending. I do not know him, she finally said. We have exchanged letters, formal and polite, telling each other facts about our lives but nothing of substance. He is 35 years old, owns a large cattle ranch, is respected in his community. He wants a wife to manage his household and give him children. I am educated, healthy, capable of bearing children, and come from a good family. On paper, we are well suited. That is not what I asked, Lucas said quietly. No, Eleanor admitted, setting down the shirt and meeting his eyes. I do not want to marry him. I never did. But my father arranged it, and I had no grounds to refuse. I have no inheritance of my own, no way to support myself. Unmarried women of my class have very limited options. I could be a governess, perhaps, or a companion to an elderly lady, but those positions are scarce and poorly paid. Marriage to Martin Ashworth offered security, safety, a home of my own, and eventual children. It seemed like the sensible choice. And now? Lucas asked, his heart beating faster than it should. Now I find myself questioning what is truly sensible, Eleanor said softly. I nearly died, Lucas. I was thrown from a stagecoach and tumbled down a mountain, and somehow, miraculously, I survived. That has to mean something. I cannot simply go back to sleep walking through my life, accepting what others tell me I should want, should do, should be. What do you want? Lucas asked, moving closer to where she sat at the table. Eleanor looked up at him, at this powerful, gentle man who had saved her life and cared for her without asking anything in return. His blue eyes were intense on her face, and she felt something flutter in her chest, something she had never felt when reading Martin Ashworth's polite, impersonal letters. I want to feel alive, she said. I want to make my own choices. I want to matter to someone, truly matter, not as a convenient solution to a household management problem, but as a person, as myself. Lucas reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. You matter, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You matter to me, Eleanor, more than you should after such a short time, more than I thought I could ever feel again. I know I have no right to say this. I know you are promised to another man, but I cannot let you leave here without telling you how I feel. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She turned her face into his palm, her lips brushing the rough skin of his hand. How do you feel? She whispered. Like I am waking up after a long sleep, Lucas said. Like the world has color again, instead of being various shades of gray. Like my heart, which I was certain had turned to stone, is somehow beating again. I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Foster, and I know it is foolish and impossible, and you will leave and I will be alone again. But I needed you to know. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. It is not foolish, she said, and it is not impossible. I am falling in love with you too, Lucas Nolan. You are everything I never knew I needed. You are strong and kind and gentle. You saved my life, and you have shown me what it feels like to be truly cared for, not as a possession or a tool, but as a person. I do not want to leave here. I do not want to go to California and marry a stranger. I want to stay with you. Lucas pulled her up from the chair, careful of her injured leg, and wrapped his arms around her. She felt tiny against his broad chest, delicate and precious, and he held her like she was the most valuable thing in the world. Are you certain? He asked against her hair. Life here is hard. The winters are brutal. We are miles from any town. You would be giving up everything you have ever known. I'm giving up nothing that matters, Eleanor said fiercely, pulling back to look into his eyes. Everything that matters is right here, in this cabin, in your arms. I choose this, Lucas. I choose you. He kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that sent warmth flooding through both their bodies. It was Eleanor's first real kiss, and it was nothing like the chaste pecks she had exchanged with suitors at Boston parties. This was real and deep and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. I have nothing to offer you, Lucas said, resting his forehead against hers. No fine house, no servants, no society parties or fancy dresses, just this cabin and a simple life and all my love for whatever that is worth. Your love is worth everything, Eleanor said. It is worth more than all the fine houses and fancy parties in the world. I want to build a life with you, Lucas. I want to plant that garden and mend your shirts and sit by this fire on winter nights and wake up beside you every morning. That is all I want, all I need. They spent the rest of that day talking, making plans, discussing the practicalities of the choice Eleanor was making. Lucas explained that when fall came, he would need to make a trip to the nearest town to sell his furs and buy supplies for winter. They could go together, and Eleanor could send a letter to her father explaining that she had survived the crash, but had decided not to continue to California. She would write to Martin Ashworth as well, releasing him from their engagement and apologizing for the inconvenience. Your father will not be happy, Lucas warned. You are giving up a wealthy husband for a mountain man with nothing. I'm giving up a stranger for the man I love, Eleanor corrected. My father will have to accept it. I am of age. I can make my own decisions. And you are not nothing, Lucas Nolan. You are everything. As the weeks passed and Eleanor's leg healed, they fell into a comfortable rhythm of domestic partnership. Eleanor proved to be a quick learner, adapting to the demands of mountain life with determination and creativity. She learned to cook over the open fire, to preserve meat and vegetables for winter storage, to identify edible plants in the forest surrounding the cabin. Lucas taught her how to fish in the nearby stream, how to set small traps for rabbits, how to predict the weather by reading the clouds and the behavior of animals. She still struggled with tasks that required standing for long periods, her broken leg not yet strong enough to bear full weight, but she found ways to work sitting down. She would sit on a stool by the fire and stir the pot, sit at the table and prepare vegetables, sit on the porch and mend clothing or make candles from rendered animal fat. Lucas marveled at her resilience, at her willingness to embrace a life so different from everything she had known. He had expected her to grow homesick for Boston, to miss the comforts and conveniences of civilization, but instead she seemed to bloom in the wilderness. Her cheeks grew pink from the fresh air and sun, her hands developed calluses from work, her laughter rang through the cabin more and more frequently. They grew closer with each passing day, learning each other's habits and preferences, developing the comfortable intimacy of a couple who had been together for years rather than weeks. Lucas would wake before dawn and lie in the darkness listening to Eleanor breathe, marveling that she was real, that she had chosen him, that he had been given this unexpected second chance at happiness. Eleanor would watch Lucas work, admiring the easy strength with which he swung an axe or hauled water, the capable way he moved through tasks that would have defeated lesser men. She felt safe with him in a way she had never felt safe before, not just physically protected, but emotionally secure, knowing that he valued her thoughts and opinions, that he saw her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Eleanor broached the subject that had been on both their minds. "We should be married," she said quietly. "Properly married, before we go to town and before we send those letters. I do not want there to be any question about my choice, any suggestion that you somehow took advantage of me, or that this is anything less than what I truly want." Lucas took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "There is no preacher up here," he said. "We would have to wait until we go to town, and that is still several weeks away." "Then we make our vows here," Eleanor said, turning to face him. "Just you and me and God and these mountains as witnesses. We pledge ourselves to each other, and when we get to town we can make it legal with a preacher, but in our hearts and before God, we will already be married." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then he stood and pulled Eleanor gently to her feet, supporting her weight as she balanced on her good leg. The sun was sinking behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. "Eleanor Foster," Lucas said solemnly, taking both her hands in his, "I vow to love you for the rest of my days. I will protect you, provide for you, cherish you, and honor you. I will be faithful to you in body and heart. I will stand beside you through whatever trials may come, and I will thank God every day for bringing you into my life. This I swear on my life and my love." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady as she replied, "Lucas Nolan, I vow to love you for the rest of my days. I will stand beside you as your partner and your equal. I will build a home with you, share your joys and your sorrows, and face whatever challenges come our way with courage and faith. I will be faithful to you in body and heart, and I will thank God every day for the gift of your love. This I swear on my life and my love." They sealed their vows with a kiss as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. There were no witnesses except the mountains and the forest, no music except the evening song of birds settling for the night, no celebration except the joy that filled both their hearts. But it was enough, more than enough, because they had each other. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed as a husband and wife. Lucas was gentle, mindful of Eleanor's still healing injuries, and she was trusting, giving herself to him completely. They moved together in the darkness, discovering the rhythms and pleasures of physical intimacy, expressing with their bodies the love that words could not fully capture. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Eleanor's head resting on Lucas's broad chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her slight frame. "I never knew it could be like this," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "I never knew I could feel this way." "Neither did I," Lucas admitted. "Not even before with Margaret. What I feel for you is different, deeper, somehow, like you were made to fit against my heart." We were made for each other, Eleanor agreed sleepily. The crash, the ravine, all of it brought me to you. I would go through it all again if this was the result. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the aspens. Eleanor's leg had healed enough that she could walk without the crutch, though she still favored it, and Lucas suspected she always would. It did not slow her down much, though. She spent her days making the cabin more comfortable, sewing curtains from fabric Lucas had tucked away in a trunk, braiding a rug from scraps of cloth and old rope, organizing and cleaning until the rough cabin shone with homely comfort. Lucas began preparing for the journey to town, checking and repairing the pack saddle for his mule, sorting through his accumulated furs to select the best ones for sale. The nearest settlement of any size was a mining town called Silver Creek, a 4-day journey on foot through the mountains. With Eleanor unable to make that journey on foot, Lucas fashioned a travois similar to the one he had used to bring her up from the ravine, this one fitted with a comfortable seat and padded with blankets and furs. The journey was slow, but pleasant. The weather held clear and cool, perfect for traveling. They would walk for several hours, then stop to rest and eat the provisions Eleanor had packed. At night, Lucas would make camp, building a fire and setting up a simple shelter from a canvas tarp. They would sleep wrapped in blankets, Eleanor cradled against Lucas's warmth, the stars brilliant above them in the clear mountain air. During the long hours of travel, they talked about everything and nothing. Eleanor told Lucas stories from her childhood, memories of her mother, adventures with friends in Boston. Lucas shared tales of his brothers, pranks they had played as boys, lessons their father had taught them about working the land and living honest lives. "Do you ever miss them?" Eleanor asked on the third day as they rested beside a small creek. "Your family?" "Sometimes," Lucas admitted. "Especially my mother. She took Margaret's death hard, said she had loved her like a daughter. When I left, she cried and begged me to stay, said running away would not heal my grief. She was probably right, but I could not stay. I wrote to her once, a few years back, to let her know I was alive and well. I do not know if she got the letter." "You should write to her again," Eleanor suggested. "Tell her about me, about us. I would like to meet her someday if that would be possible. I would like to meet all of them." Lucas looked surprised. "You would travel all the way to Missouri just to meet my family?" "They are your family, which makes them my family now," Eleanor said simply. "Of course I want to meet them, and I think your mother deserves to know that you have found happiness again, that you are not alone in these mountains anymore." Lucas pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. "We will write to her from Silver Creek," he promised. "We will tell her everything and invite her to visit if she wishes, though I warn you, my family is nothing like what you are accustomed to. They are simple farming folk, plain-spoken and rough around the edges." "Then they will fit right in with us," Eleanor said with a laugh. "I am hardly the fine Boston lady I used to be. I have calluses on my hands and I can gut a fish and I sleep on a bed made of pine logs. I think I will get along just fine with your family." They reached Silver Creek on the 4th day, arriving in the late afternoon. The town was rough and rowdy, filled with miners and prospectors, saloon girls and merchants hoping to get rich off the silver strike that had given the town its name. Wooden buildings lined a single muddy street, and the sound of piano music and raucous laughter spilled from the saloons even in daylight. Lucas took them directly to the only hotel, a 2-story structure that looked slightly less disreputable than the surrounding establishments. He secured a room for the night, ignoring the raised eyebrows of the clerk who clearly disapproved of Eleanor's buckskin traveling clothes and windburned face. Once Eleanor was settled in the room, Lucas went to conduct his business. He sold his furs to the trading post for a fair price, then visited the general store to purchase the supplies they would need for the coming winter. Coffee, sugar, flour, salt, ammunition for his rifle, needles and thread, a few precious luxuries like tea and molasses that would make the long winter months more bearable. He also purchased fabric for Eleanor, good sturdy cotton in several colors, and thread and buttons so she could make herself some proper dresses. He bought her a warm wool cloak for the winter, a pair of sturdy boots, and ribbons for her hair because he had noticed her looking longingly at them in the store window. The purchases severely depleted his earnings from the furs, but he did not care. He wanted Eleanor to have nice things, wanted to provide for her in whatever way he could. When he returned to the hotel room with his purchases, Eleanor was writing letters at the small desk by the window. She had already completed the one to Martin Ashworth, a brief formal note explaining that she had survived the crash, but had decided to remain in Wyoming territory and could not honor their engagement. She apologized for any inconvenience and wished him well in finding a more suitable wife. The letter to her father was more difficult, and Lucas could see the tension in her shoulders as she worked on it. She wanted to be honest, but also wanted to avoid causing unnecessary hurt. She explained about the crash, about Lucas saving her life, about falling in love and choosing to stay. She assured her father that she was safe and happy, that she had made her choice with full awareness of what she was giving up and what she was gaining. She asked for his understanding, if not his blessing, and signed it with love. "Do you think he will respond?" Eleanor asked as she sealed the letter with wax. "I do not know," Lucas said honestly, "but you have told him the truth, and that is all you can do. The rest is up to him." The next morning they visited the small church on the edge of town and found the circuit preacher who served the community. He was an older man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, and he listened to their story without judgment. He agreed to marry them that very afternoon, and he did not even ask why they seemed so eager to formalize vows that were clearly already made. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the empty church with the preacher's wife and the hotel owner's daughter as witnesses. Eleanor wore her least worn dress, hastily brushed and pressed with wildflowers Lucas had picked that morning, woven into her auburn hair. Lucas had trimmed his beard and wore a clean shirt, his hair tied back neatly. They spoke the traditional vows, exchanged simple gold bands that Lucas had purchased that morning, and sealed their union with a kiss. Afterward, they signed the register, making their marriage legal and official. Eleanor signed her name as Eleanor Foster Nolan and felt a thrill of joy and rightness at seeing it written out. She was Eleanor Nolan now, mountain wife, and she had never been happier. They celebrated with a meal at the hotel restaurant, a luxury they could not often afford, but that seemed appropriate for their wedding day. Eleanor had roasted chicken for the first time in months, and fresh bread with real butter and apple pie that made her close her eyes in bliss. Lucas watched her eat with amusement and deep affection, marveling that this refined woman could take such pure joy in a simple meal. That night, in the privacy of their hotel room, they consummated their legal marriage with passion and tenderness. They had been intimate before, but this felt different, more official, more permanent. They were husband and wife now, bound together by law and God and their own choice, and that knowledge made every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of love even more meaningful. They left Silver Creek 2 days later, their mule laden with supplies and their hearts light with joy. The journey back to the cabin took 5 days this time, as they were moving more slowly with the heavily loaded mule and were in no particular hurry. They enjoyed the beautiful early autumn weather, the golden aspens and the cool, clear air, the nights spent under the stars wrapped in each other's arms. When the cabin finally came into view, Eleanor felt a surge of homecoming that surprised her. This rough log structure in the middle of the wilderness had become home in a way her father's grand Boston house never had. This was where she belonged, with Lucas, building a life together in these mountains. The winter of 1878 was harsh, with snow beginning in early October and continuing intermittently through April. Eleanor experienced her first true mountain winter, learning what it meant to be isolated for months with only Lucas for company. But she did not mind the isolation. She and Lucas were perfectly content with each other's company, spending the long winter evenings reading aloud from Lucas's small collection of books, playing cards, talking about their plans for the spring. Lucas taught Eleanor how to snowshoe so she could move around outside the cabin even when the drifts were hip-deep. She learned to split kindling and keep the fire going, to cook on the temperamental wood stove Lucas had hauled up the mountain years before, to make soap and candles and all the other necessities of isolated living. They were intimate frequently, their passion for each other not dimmed by the close quarters or the tedium of winter. Lucas never tired of discovering new ways to make Eleanor gasp and sigh, and Eleanor grew bolder in her explorations of his body, learning what touches made his breath catch and his eyes darken with desire. In February, Eleanor realized that her monthly courses had not come for several months. She waited another few weeks to be certain before mentioning it to Lucas, and when she finally told him she thought she might be with child, his whoop of joy rattled the windows and sent her laughing into his arms. "A baby," he kept saying, his large hand splayed across her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though the answer was obvious in his shining eyes. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Lucas said. "Terrified, amazed, grateful, excited, all of those and more. You have given me so much already, Eleanor. You brought me back to life, gave me a reason to look forward rather than always back. And now this, a child, a family of our own. I do not have words for what I feel." "Then show me," Eleanor said, pulling him down for a kiss. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Eleanor suffered from terrible sickness in the mornings for the first few months. Lucas hovered over her anxiously, bringing her ginger tea and dry toast, rubbing her back when she was ill, worrying constantly that something might go wrong. His worry only increased as her belly grew and the reality of childbirth approached. They were 4 days from the nearest town, with no doctor or midwife nearby. If something went wrong during the delivery, Eleanor could die, and the thought terrified him. Eleanor was calmer about the whole thing, trusting in her body and in God to see her through safely. She read the one medical book Lucas owned, memorizing the sections on childbirth, preparing as best she could for what was to come. She made tiny clothes from soft fabric, prepared blankets and diapers, set aside a corner of the cabin as a nursery. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Eleanor's belly grew round and full. She waddled more than walked, her back aching and her ankles swollen, but she remained cheerful and active, insisting on helping with the spring planting of the garden they had planned. Lucas built raised beds near the cabin and filled them with rich soil from the forest floor, mixed with manure from his mule. Together, they planted seeds Eleanor had purchased in Silver Creek the previous fall. Carrots, beans, peas, squash, tomatoes, herbs for cooking and medicine. Eleanor tended the garden daily, talking to the plants as she watered them, encouraging them to grow strong and healthy. In late May, just as the garden was beginning to sprout, Eleanor's labor began. It started in the early morning with mild cramping that gradually intensified throughout the day. By evening, the pains were coming regularly and strongly, and Eleanor retreated to the bed while Lucas boiled water and gathered the supplies they had prepared. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Eleanor was strong, but childbirth was a brutal process, and Lucas felt helpless watching her suffer, able to do nothing but offer water and encouragement and hold her hand when the contractions peaked. He had helped deliver foals and calves before, but this was different. This was Eleanor, and his fear threatened to overwhelm him more than once, but Eleanor was stronger than either of them knew. She bore the pain with gritted teeth and determination, following the instincts of countless women before her. And finally, as the sun was setting on the second day of labor, she gave a final tremendous push, and their baby was born. Lucas caught the infant in his trembling hands, tears streaming down his face as he saw the tiny, perfect child. "It is a boy," he said in wonder. "Eleanor, we have a son." He cleaned the baby quickly and placed him on Eleanor's chest, and she wrapped her arms around the tiny, squalling bundle with tears of joy and exhaustion running down her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." They named him Samuel Lucas Nolan, Samuel after Eleanor's grandfather whom she had adored, and Lucas because Eleanor insisted their son should carry his father's name. Samuel was a healthy baby with a good strong cry and his father's blue eyes. He nursed well and slept in bursts, waking every few hours to eat, and both his parents fell completely in love with him from the first moment. Lucas was besotted with his son, constantly hovering over the cradle he had built, checking to make sure Samuel was still breathing, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes. He would sit for hours just watching the baby sleep, wonder and gratitude radiating from his face. Eleanor recovered well from the birth, though she was exhausted in a way she had never experienced before. But even in her exhaustion, she was happy, delighting in every coo and gurgle from their son, finding joy in the simple act of nursing him or changing his diaper or soothing him to sleep. That summer was one of the happiest of both their lives. The garden flourished under Eleanor's care, providing them with fresh vegetables to supplement their diet of game meat. Samuel grew quickly, becoming plump and rosy-cheeked, his toothless smiles lighting up the cabin. Lucas hunted and fished and tended his trap lines, providing for his small family with pride and dedication. Eleanor cooked and cleaned and cared for Samuel, and in the evenings, the three of them would sit on the porch watching the sunset, Samuel nursing while Lucas's arm was wrapped around Eleanor's shoulders. In late summer, a visitor arrived at the cabin, the first person besides Lucas and Eleanor to set foot there in over a year. It was a woman, gray-haired and weathered, riding a sturdy horse and leading a pack mule. She called out a greeting as she approached, and Lucas stepped out onto the porch with his rifle, cautious but not hostile. "Lucas Nolan?" the woman asked as she dismounted. "I'm looking for Lucas Nolan." "I'm Lucas Nolan," he replied. "Who is asking?" The woman smiled, and suddenly Lucas saw the resemblance. "I'm your mother, Lucas. I got your letter, and I came as soon as I could manage it." Lucas stood frozen in shock for a moment. Then he set down the rifle and ran to embrace her. "Ma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot believe you came all this way." "Did you think I would stay in Missouri once I knew where you were?" his mother scolded gently, pulling back to look at him. "When I got your letter saying you had married and were happy again, I knew I had to come see for myself. Your brothers wanted to come too, but the farm needed them. They send their love and their congratulations." Eleanor had come to the door with Samuel in her arms, and Lucas's mother turned to her with a warm smile. "You must be Eleanor," she said, "and this must be my grandson. Oh, Lucas, he is beautiful." "Come inside, please," Eleanor said. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Let me make you some tea and you can tell us everything." Lucas's mother, whose name was Martha, stayed with them for 2 weeks, delighting in getting to know her daughter-in-law and grandson. She told them all the news from Missouri, how Lucas's brothers were all married now with children of their own, how the farm was prospering, how the community had grown and changed. Martha was impressed with the life Lucas and Eleanor had built in the mountains. She admired the garden, the well-kept cabin, the obvious love between her son and his wife. "You have done well, Lucas," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch. "I was worried about you for so long, thought you would waste away from grief and loneliness. But you found your way back to happiness. Eleanor is a treasure, and that baby is a blessing." "I know, Ma," Lucas said, watching Eleanor through the open door as she nursed Samuel in the rocking chair Lucas had built for her. "I know how lucky I am. I thought my life was over when Margaret died, thought I would never feel anything but pain again. But Eleanor showed me that the heart has room for more than one love, that finding happiness again does not diminish what came before." "That is wisdom, son," Martha said. "Hard-won wisdom, but truth nonetheless." When Martha finally left to return to Missouri, she extracted a promise from Lucas and Eleanor that they would visit the farm the following summer, bringing Samuel to meet his uncles and aunts and cousins. She also insisted on leaving them most of the supplies she had brought on her pack mule, saying she could easily replace them when she reached the next town, but they needed them more in their remote cabin. The seasons continued their cycle. Samuel grew from an infant to a toddler, taking his first wobbly steps on the cabin floor while his parents applauded and encouraged him. He was a happy child, fearless and curious, and Lucas had to constantly watch him to keep him from wandering into the forest or tumbling into the creek. When Samuel was 2 years old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and in the spring of 1881, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret Rose Nolan, Margaret after Lucas's first wife, because Eleanor insisted that she should be honored, and Rose because Eleanor loved the wild roses that grew near the cabin. Margaret was a calm baby, content to lie in her cradle and watch the world with solemn dark eyes. She looked more like Eleanor than Lucas, with her mother's delicate features and auburn hair, though she had her father's strong will and determination. That summer, true to their promise, Lucas and Eleanor made the journey to Missouri with both children. It was a monumental undertaking, traveling hundreds of miles with a 2-year-old and an infant, but they managed it over the course of several weeks, taking their time and stopping frequently to rest and let the children play. The reunion with Lucas's family was joyous and emotional. His brothers embraced him, his sisters-in-law welcomed Eleanor, and the children were passed around and spoiled shamelessly by their grandmothers and aunts and uncles. They stayed for a month, And in that time, Eleanor got to see where Lucas had grown up, the farm he had helped build, the graves of his father and his first wife. Eleanor stood beside Lucas at Margaret's grave, holding baby Margaret in her arms while Samuel clung to his father's leg. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly to the simple headstone. "Thank you for loving him and for helping make him the man he is. I promise to take care of him, to love him the way you would have wanted him to be loved." Lucas pulled her close with his free arm, overcome with emotion. The fact that Eleanor could honor his past love rather than being threatened by it was just one more reason he loved her so deeply. They returned to their mountain cabin, renewed and refreshed by the time with family, but also grateful to be home. The mountains had become their place, the cabin their sanctuary, and while they enjoyed visiting civilization, they were always glad to return to their peaceful, isolated life. More children followed over the years. In 1883, twin boys arrived, strong and healthy and utterly identical. Lucas and Eleanor named them James and Joseph, and keeping track of which was which became a family joke. 2 years later, another daughter arrived, Catherine Eleanor, called Katie, who had her father's blue eyes and her mother's gentle disposition. The cabin grew as the family grew. Lucas added 2 more rooms, one for the boys and one for the girls, and expanded the porch so there was room for everyone to sit together in the evenings. The garden expanded as well, now providing most of their vegetables through the growing season, with plenty left over to preserve for winter. Samuel grew into a strong boy who idolized his father and spent every possible moment following him through the mountains, learning to track and hunt and read the wilderness. Margaret was quieter, more studious, and Eleanor taught her to read and write and do arithmetic using the limited books they possessed. The twins were wild and rambunctious, full of energy and mischief, while little Katie toddled after her older siblings trying to keep up. Lucas and Eleanor remained deeply in love, their bond only strengthening with time and shared experiences. They had built a good life together, a life full of love and laughter and the simple satisfactions of hard work and family. On quiet evenings after the children were in bed, they would sit together on the porch, Eleanor's head resting on Lucas's shoulder, and marvel at how far they had come from that terrible day when the stagecoach had crashed and changed both their lives forever. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked one night as they watched the stars come out. "Giving up your life in Boston, the comfort and society and all of that for this hard life in the mountains?" Eleanor looked up at him with love shining in her eyes. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life, with you, with our children, is worth more than all the comfort and society in the world. You gave me love, Lucas. Real love, the kind that lasts and grows and sustains. You gave me a purpose beyond being decorative and obedient. You gave me freedom and joy and a family. How could I ever regret that?" "I love you," Lucas said, kissing her forehead. "I love you more than I can ever express with words." "Show me then," Eleanor said with a smile, the same words she had spoken on their unofficial wedding night all those years ago. They went inside to the bed they shared and made love with the practiced ease and deep intimacy of a couple who knew each other completely. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, they fell asleep, content and grateful for the life they had built together. The years passed in a pleasant rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Samuel turned 18 and announced his intention to stay in the mountains, to build his own cabin a few miles from theirs and start his own trap lines. Lucas helped him select a good location and build a sturdy structure, proud of the man his son had become. Margaret, at 16, surprised them all by declaring she wanted to be a teacher and asking to go to Denver for proper schooling. It was hard to let her go, but Lucas and Eleanor recognized her gift for learning and did not want to hold her back. They used their carefully saved money to send her to a teaching college, and she returned 2 years later with a certificate and a position at the newly established school in Silver Creek. The twins and Katie were still at home, the twins now strapping young men of 15 who helped their father with the heavy work, and Katie, a thoughtful 13-year-old who showed signs of having her mother's practical wisdom and her father's strength. In 1896, Martha Nolan passed away peacefully in Missouri at the age of 78. Lucas received the news by letter, delivered months after the fact, and grieved deeply for the mother he had reconnected with, thanks to Eleanor's insistence. The family held a memorial service in the clearing by their cabin, and Lucas spoke about his mother's strength, her love, her willingness to travel across the country to make peace with her wandering son. That same year, Eleanor and Lucas learned they were going to be grandparents. Samuel had married a girl from Silver Creek, a strong, sensible young woman named Anna, who adapted to mountain life with the same determination Eleanor had shown years before. Through it all, through the joys of grandchildren and the sorrows of aging parents passing away, through the changes sweeping the country as the wild frontier became more settled and civilized, Lucas and Eleanor remained devoted to each other. Their hair turned gray, their faces lined with the years, their bodies slower than they once were, but their love never diminished. On a warm summer evening in 1915, 37 years after the stagecoach crash that had brought them together, Eleanor and Lucas sat on their porch watching the sunset over the mountains they both loved so much. They were alone for once, all their children grown and gone to their own lives, the cabin quiet except for the evening sounds of birds and wind in the pines. "Do you remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked, her hand clasped in Lucas's weathered one. "Every detail," Lucas replied. "You were lying in that creek, more dead than alive, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, even covered in blood and dirt." Eleanor laughed softly. "You saved my life that day." "And you saved mine," Lucas countered. "Not my physical life, perhaps, but you saved me from the half-life I was living, brought me back into the light, gave me a reason to live fully again." "We saved each other then," Eleanor said contentedly. "We were meant to find each other. I truly believe that. All the pain and loss that brought us both to that moment, it was worth it because it led us here, to this life we built together." "I would not change a single thing," Lucas agreed. "Well, maybe I would have asked you to marry me sooner, made it official before that trip to Silver Creek." "We were married in our hearts from that first night we made our vows under the stars," Eleanor reminded him. "The legal ceremony was just a formality for the rest of the world. We knew what we were to each other long before any preacher spoke words over us." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, the sky blazing with color. Lucas felt content in a way he had never imagined possible all those years ago when grief had driven him into these mountains. He had built a good life here, a life full of love and purpose and meaning. He had a wife he adored, children and grandchildren who brought him joy, and the deep satisfaction of knowing he had honored both his past and his present, had loved and been loved in return. Eleanor rested her head on Lucas's broad shoulder, her body fitting against his the way it had for nearly 4 decades. She thought about the frightened young woman she had been, traveling toward a marriage she did not want, trapped by expectations and obligations. The crash had freed her from that path, had quite literally thrown her into a new life, and she had seized that second chance with both hands. She had found love, real love, the kind that sustained and nourished and grew stronger with time. She had found purpose and partnership, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful with her own hands and heart. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Lucas stood and helped Eleanor to her feet. They went inside together, to the bed they had shared for so many years, and held each other close through the night. And in the morning they would wake together and face another day, grateful for every moment they had been given, thankful for the stagecoach crash and the mountain man, and the love that had grown from tragedy into something beautiful and lasting and true. Their story was not one of grand adventure or dramatic rescues beyond that first day. It was a story of quiet devotion, of choosing each other every single day, of building a life together through patience and work and unwavering commitment. It was a story of love found in the most unlikely circumstances, nurtured carefully through challenges and triumphs, and sustained across decades by 2 people who recognized in each other the missing piece of their own hearts. And when the time finally came, years later, for their children and grandchildren to gather and remember them, the story they told was not just of the stagecoach crash or the dramatic rescue. They told the story of a love that had endured, of 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and beautiful in the wild mountains of Wyoming territory. They told the story of Eleanor and Lucas Nolan, who had proven that love, true love, can grow even from the most tragic beginnings into something that outlasts a lifetime and touches generations yet to come.